Hey everybody, this is Kit Merker here from Noble 9, and I have a panel today on Istio. Is the world actually ready for service mesh? And what actual real world problem does service mesh solve?
A year ago, I would have answered that question that the world is definitely ready for service mesh. But after working with a lot of enterprise customers, I would say the world is definitely not ready for service mesh in the way it's packaged at the moment. We need a lot more usability to come into it, a lot more ease of use. I'm starting to see users leverage it for certain type of operations for testing canaries easily, doing A/B type of deployments a little bit more easily. Blue greens, but they're definitely in the enterprise, in the on-prem space at least. They're approaching this very tentatively. So I would say that the world is not ready at all for service mesh. I think it's a great add-on at this point. Like I said, a year ago, I was at a position where logging, metrics, service mesh were all on the cluster at day one. Because you will need the moment that you realize you need to do tracing is after the fact that you don't have tracing available for you. So you'd like to have it there as a developer. But from an organizational point of view, I'm not seeing a lot of adoption just yet. There's a lot of rough edges, let's say, in the service mesh world right now for the enterprises. A lot of confusion. And I think the decisions with the foundation added more to the confusion for service mesh than it helped solve.
Thanks, Matt. So we're going to get to the foundation in just a second here, but I wanted to see, does anybody disagree with that position on that the world is ready? Dan's kind of looking like maybe he has something to say.
I'm mostly just a contrarian. I think that the world is ready in the sense that there are some places that struggle with the problems that service mesh solves, and for the most part, people that jump onto the service mesh bandwagon don't actually have that problem yet, or don't have it in such pain that the complexity is worth it. We often hear people talk about Kubernetes as being too complex. Well, really, the problem is that they just haven't run into the complexities that Kubernetes solves. And I think service mesh is the same way. There are a lot of people where the complexity that service mesh solves just actually isn't met. And so people end up adopting it that probably don't need to yet. But there are at least a couple organizations that do have that level of complexity where it does solve a good problem. But I agree, at least 50% with Matt that like a lot of people that grab it and install it probably don't need it.
So I want to turn to Matt Turner for a second. And Matt, can you, I'm sorry we have two Matts, but Matt Turner, can you help explain maybe some of the use cases? And actually, when William Morgan came on Monday and talked about it, he talked a lot about API and he talked about websites as a good use case for service mesh. Well, what do you think about that? Is there more nuance to the use cases that are appropriate for service mesh?
Yeah, I guess to answer both questions, I would almost disagree again with are we ready? I think what world, right? Some worlds are ready. If you're building Greenfield, you can absolutely use a service mesh in place of what you would have done in app with Spring Boot or something, or you in Jaeger libraries. You are where we are with Kubernetes maybe 4 years ago, right? Where you had to install Kubernetes yourself. You have to do the same thing with the service mesh. There's very little help. There's no management plane. You have to understand it. You have to run it yourself. So I think some people are ready and some people are building it in as opposed to going full, Spring Stack. To answer your question, yeah, like the websites, I think Kubernetes is honestly still the same. You have a stateless horizontally scaling service, you're in luck. If you try to do too much, I mean, how long have we been talking about states and databases on Kubernetes for, right? As soon as you try to go off that piece, you still come unstuck on Kubernetes, in my experience. Like if you try to do it for real. Same with service meshes. It can do more. There's a bunch of development around NSM, network service mesh, which is like high performance layer 2 or bump in the wire, telco and NFV stuff, using like crazy kernel packet acceleration and all this kind of stuff. Like that's a specific use case. It's being worked on still, but it's coming. I think service meshes are better. So in Istio world, the Envoy proxy understands the MySQL protocol, right? So you can now get observability for free for your MySQL or your PostgreSQL traffic. And you can see by query types, you can start to do routing on it. You can actually do, for example, database sharding. It is maybe not the right thing to do, but as a technology example, you can shard databases based on database requests based, say, on the table that they're going to, because Envoy understands that protocol at like layer 7. So without waffling too much, because it's a huge topic, easy path, happy path for web, but there is definitely other kind of stuff coming.
Great, thank you. And Nitish, I want to get your take on something. When we look at sort of the service mesh solutions in the space, one of the dimensions that I've heard about is that there's the ease of use on one end of the spectrum and sort of industrial grade on the other, right? And so balancing between getting started versus kind of the is it really the thing you need in production? What's your take on that trade-off between easy and industrial grade?
I mean, easy is pretty helpful for someone to get introduced to service meshes, but generally, I think you're right. With the production grade is where we actually come down to the use cases. Different service industries have different use cases, and I don't know if every service mesh is one size fits all. You have NSM, which is probably like Matt suggested. It's a very specific use case. Probably not easy to start with. You have Linkerd for someone who is just starting to adopt containers or just getting introduced to Kubernetes. Sure, that makes sense. They don't have a whole bunch of use cases laid out yet. Maybe it's just MTLS or some observability, but yeah, for the production grades, and I would count Istio in the production grade. Yeah, it's it's a steeper learning curve, but I think that is something that needs to be adopted. And
So this is we'll come back to some of the on-ramp stuff in a minute, but I want to get to the sort of elephant in the room question. But last week, as everybody knows, Google announced that Istio, along with two other projects, are going to be joining a newly formed Open Usage Commons, and not the CNCF as some had expected. And they're using this as the neutral home for the trademarks. And looking at one of their partners, IBM, they put out a statement. Jason McGee, who's the CTO for the cloud platform at IBM, he said that it doesn't live up to the community's expectations for open governance. So I'd like to hear, what do you guys think?
So I'm just put it out there. I disagree with the decision that Google made. For me, I'm going to speak personally, not as a person from that app. I feel that it's going to fragment the community quite a bit by not having. I'm not going to say it needs to be in the CNCF. And I think I think we need to address that the CNCF has its own issues as well, and that perhaps we need to try to fix some of those issues. But starting another foundation just blossoms more issues to deal with. And my fear is that you start to silo the community itself. So the people who are attending events, the people who are intermingling with each other. Now we have two separate places, and I fear for siloing because CNCF we have Linkerd. Why would we have to talk? Why do we need to evangelize around Istio as a project? It's not a project of the CNCF, so you'll see the CNCF likely evangelize more around Linkerd, and then that will silo the Istio community outside of the Kubernetes community, in my opinion. That's my fear, is fracturing the community. Google can make its decisions around its technology. And clearly they're making business decisions, and that's their right to figure out how to monetize, and more power to them if they want to do that. But I think it's a disservice to say it's neutral.
Okay, is there a countervailing point of view? Nitish, do you see the other side of the argument?
No, actually, I agree, and wanted to add to how CNCF has been kind of dealing with Istio as well prior to this decision. So it was pretty evident with most of the KubeCons is how they were kind of hush-hush about Istio. They were trying to push Linkerd forward. So that fracture already exists, right? But yeah, Matt has a perfect point that once you start siloing Istio, they're gonna kind of completely silence discussions around Istio at the CNCF or the KubeCon events, and I think that's going to be a big problem because Istio is something that people have picked. I wouldn't say it's a winner, but it's seen more adoption than the rest. So I think that's going to have some detrimental effects.
That's probably the core problem, is that Istio has been much more popular. So it's actually in a position where it can make a little bit more of a stake in the ground and go against the grain because it does have the most adoption. Most people that kind of view it as one of the most mature solutions. I know that Linkerd is out there screaming at me right now, but that's just what I hear in the community. I know it is frustrating to have them be in a separate governance, and I won't pretend that I fully understand all those complexities. But thinking about where Google's coming from, I think that they have they're really scared about seeing things run away from them. It's interesting. They tend to want to give things away until they realize how valuable they are. There was a time when Google went to Docker and said, "Hey, we got this thing called Kubernetes. We'd really love for you to have it. Can we just give it to you?" And Docker looked at it and they're like, "Nah, man, we got this Swarm thing. It's really cool. That's definitely the future." Turns out that was probably the worst outcome of a meeting ever in history of time, as far as Docker goes. And I think that they're looking at that in the past, and they said we had this whole Kubernetes strategy that was going to get us into the cloud game in a big way. We're still a distant third. We made a ton of ground, but maybe we gave away too much. And now they're looking at the CNCF, and it feels like it's been pulled away from them a little too much. I could understand why they would be a little hesitant, and especially given that I don't know that the CNCF necessarily has a brilliant history of helping competing projects, and maybe they do, and I can't think of an example right now.
Isn't it kind of self-defeating then? I mean, if this is this community where the community is going, or Kubernetes is, and other things, and now they've got this sort of this separate entity, which is would have this fragmentation. Does that kind of defeat the purpose of being a part of the community, or is that as kind of Dan pointed out, like, is that because of the power of adoption that this is that they'll bring the community with them?
I think there's two sides to it. On the one hand, I applaud Google for saying we believe this thing is valuable and it should exist above and beyond Google, and it should have some kind of governance that's not maybe dictated by quarter-to-quarter sales cycles. Like, I applaud them for taking this valuable IP and essentially putting it in escrow, right, and saying this belongs to more than just Google. Yeah, I totally share Matt's concern that the problem is the CNCF has this momentum, it has this mass of almost every other project, and the fragmentation. Especially if you look, Envoy is a like headline CNCF project, and the two projects, they rely so closely on each other. And I don't think this is going to stop the engineers talking, except of course there is the point, where does this stuff get discussed? KubeCons, London is a big city. It has a Kubernetes and an Istio and a cloud native meetup. A lot of towns I know will have one CNCF style, all of DevOps meetup. If the politics really do go bad, that I guess would be my worry. If you're Google, what does the CNCF do for a project? It defends copyright. It does marketing and does evangelism. If you're some guy in your bedroom in your evenings doing an open source project, and on your own, the CNCF can be massively helpful with that kind of stuff. If you're Google, you're like, we've got money. We can do marketing. Like, Google is an advertising company, right? We can defend patents. I'm sure they've got a few lawyers. So I guess if you look, they're like, well, what is the value from that point of view that the CNCF offers over and above others? It was clearly calculated and decisive to make a new foundation. And yeah, they've thrown Angular in because it's kind of the other open source project they've got. Like, okay, you don't like the CNCF, or you maybe don't see the value. The Apache Foundation exists. It does good stuff. But there's a lot to consider, I think, and I'm sure this has been thought about for a long time.
What I don't understand about this, if you're going to establish a separate foundation, why not have it branch off of the Linux Foundation, much like the CD Foundation, and establish a service mesh foundation, and then you put all the service mesh technology into that foundation, and you put ancillary technology into that foundation. Move Linkerd in. We have to understand this is going to be a multi-mesh world. There's not going to be a single leading service mesh technology. Have a single foundation for that, or keep it in the CNCF. A separate foundation, and then Angular just thrown in just felt like, well, we need more than one thing in this thing. The other thing is, I keep thinking that this is a way to defend Anthos in some way, that there's a lot riding on Anthos on premise, tying up hybrid cloud. Istio is a core component of that. So that's where my head goes if I put my business hat on.
If it's all about Anthos, the better play would be to keep Istio in the CNCF, because wouldn't you then have like a better community foothold? And I mean, this goes into something that you said, Turner, where you were saying that this seemed like a really calculated decision. I think it seemed like a YOLO decision. Like I didn't, like I'm not sure I totally understand the reasoning behind it. And it could be just because we don't have the variables, but it seemed like we just don't want too much power centralized over here, and so we're just gonna kind of create disruption over here to just create some balance.
I'd like to add to that is it confounds me that now they have IBM and the Red Hat guy is miffed. Uh, it's definitely going to affect their relationship when there was an agreement to go into the CNCF, and that's something I'm concerned about because IBM has played a really big role in propagating Istio and developing that as a platform. So that's scary to me with this whole decision that how IBM is going to take it. Is there going to be maybe a contending mesh that comes out of IBM? I don't know, but it'll be interesting to see how the collaboration plays out.
Matt Turner, briefly, yes.
Yeah, sure. I guess just if I'm going to say something controversial, I guess just reading the tea leaves, like if it is all about Anthos, then so Istio is not easy to use. Not very much effort has been put into making it easy to use. Why not? Because it was only ever intended to be a component of Anthos. It was a stepping stone to Anthos. Google don't care about Istio's use and adoption. They care about Anthos, and they've open sourced one of the major components. So having it in the CNCF means that it's going to be taken in a different direction. Google, it's a building block, and they don't care about its end users, its API surface. Having it, retaining that control allows them to take it in a direction that Anthos needs. If I were to say something controversial that I made up, right? But how about that? Is that plausible?
Very plausible.
So yeah, we've kind of talked a bit about the the intrigue and the sort of the possible motivations and things like that behind the scenes. But I remember someone once saying that open source foundations are sort of the country clubs of open source, and I wonder if, from a contributor perspective and from like the real world of enterprise IT, adopters, if any of this actually matters, and is it something that will have an actual effect on the future of the technology, or is this just something that is controversial to sort of a small in crowd of people who care deeply, and with no disrespect, but does it really in the grand scheme of things, does it matter?
I think it's clear that this was done to make a large enterprise sale for Google, and so the users, the customers are starting to vote, and the customers are voting for Istio in many ways. And I don't think customers would really care what foundation it sits in, as long as there's certain checkboxes that are checked for those customers. And so I think William talked about certain DoD type of customers would have certain requirements that this would meet. And so, I think it makes sense. But I think this is very much an in crowd. Us, kind of going, this is kind of the drama going on in our world. But to the rest of the planet, to end customers, they're only going to care if there's a certain sense of neutrality that hits their checkboxes, and that's it.
Well, I was just going to say that they still have Envoy, which is obviously super important in the CNCF. If there's any winner of the service meshes, it's Envoy, and that's still a Google led project really that's within the CNCF. So I feel like we have enough ties to keep everything together ultimately.
So I want to take the conversation before we wrap up a slightly different direction and bring it back to the use cases of service mesh for just a second. We can set aside sort of the foundations and all that kind of stuff. One area that we're all addressing, I think, is the area of reliability in the time of COVID, right? And we think about sort of this new world that digital transformation, these organizations have been thrust through overnight, right? Their 3 to 5 year digital transformation plans have all kind of had to happen very quickly. And I'm trying to make a connection between service mesh technology and this new kind of digital reality and reliable software. One thing that William Morgan shared with me was that the sort of service level indicators or service KPIs that can be derived from service meshes, it sort of happens for free. I think Dan mentioned that earlier too, that sort of you get the metrics for free. Does service mesh lead us to a more reliable future? And how will that work at a kind of a technical, practical level?
My answer is yes, I think it will. That's it.
Great answer. Nitish.
No.
Nitish, okay, no, I'm moving on. You got your answer. Nitish, do you want to say something about that?
No, I completely agree. It is going to help with the reliability, and it is something that's being adopted by across different domains, across different industries, especially in the time of COVID. It's I think it's going to play a pretty big role, and you see it being adopted in DoD as well. So it's not just limited to consumer services, but it's playing a pretty big role in defense as well.
Yeah. Matt Turner, how does it actually work though? How does it actually affect reliability? How does it help?
Observability, especially for free, is not to be underestimated. We've got so many layers of abstraction now. I think that layer 7 observability out of the box is great. Also chaos engineering, right? With Kubernetes, it has a chaos monkey. There's also, you use cloud, you use ephemeral instances, right? You just deal with chaos from day one, and then you kind of have to, your system evolves to be resilient to it. Istio can do network layer chaos engineering, simulating faults, simulating timeouts, simulating delays, catches all of you build that in from day one in your environment, catches all of these kind of nefarious issues that only, would normally hit you like at load at exactly the wrong time when your user's hockey stick. And then there's the ability, this is better formed in Linkerd at the moment, to do traffic capture replay for CAN testing, for load testing. But I think in a bunch of ways, and actually that chaos, that network chaos, like I've got an error budget. Oh, and my upstream service, you know what? It's too reliable. They did too good a job. I need to make sure my service can cope if that upstream service has a bad week, right, and breaches its error budget. So I'm going to run in my test environment with fault injection turned on so that it looks to me like it's always like that, and then now I can deal with it. That's been super, super powerful for me in development.
Matt Baldwin, do you have anything to add on the reliability front?
Oh, I keep thinking about, so I'm going to contextualize this into COVID. And Zoom. So as COVID was hitting and all of us were moving into Zoom, I don't know how many people have noticed that the Zoom authentication was starting to go slower and slower and slower, and it took a lot longer. And now it's not happening anymore. And in my head, I'm picturing things like circuit breaking is going on. They are doing tracing. They're using Kubernetes. They're expanding things. And so I feel that this technology definitely will prepare us for a much more scalable and resilient future. And I bet you money it's already in use at places like Zoom.
Dan Garfield, I'm going to give you the last word on this. Help me, from a technical perspective, understand what the service mesh does for reliability.
You don't have a service mesh problem when you have 3 or 4 services interacting with each other. It's just not important. It's going to bring more complexity than it solves. But when you have 3,000 microservices and they're all being updated all the time, and you can't figure out where a problem lies because there are 27 services or 100 services involved in a transaction, that's where service mesh becomes the most valuable. And of course, there are all these benefits you get along the way. Oh, I get SSL, that's wonderful, and I can get security, so I can set like security level policies and stuff, and that's really nice. But being able to do all of that stuff in a scalable way is the problem that service mesh really solves. So if you don't have that scale problem, service mesh is just going to make your life more complicated. And I say this as someone who's deployed Istio on one node clusters before. It's just going to create more complexity than it solves. But when you do have those problems, when you do have thousands of microservices and they're all running around and they're going up and down and you can't tell what's going on and where the problem lies, then that distributed tracing suddenly becomes really, really important. And so if you don't have it, then you're in big trouble.
Thank you so much. I want to thank everybody on the panel, Matt Turner, Nitish Malhotra, Matt Baldwin, Dan Garfield. Great to have you all here. This is Kip Merker from Noble 9, and I'm signing off.